Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boils and ghouls, guys and gals, and non binary pals. Welcome back to The Gentleman Psychic, where I read classic stories, among other things. I am your MC, your host, your master of ceremonies, Richard-Lael. Richard-Lael is one name, not two. If I were just Richard, I'd be a dick. Anyway, my darlings, we are going to be reading our book, The Devil's Mansion, that we have started last week. Um, as you know, we like to let the clock chime in, but we've got about 2 minutes before that time. So now it is time to go get a drink, pick your poison. Mine is, of course, arsenic. Hello, Lauren Morgan Richards. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and ghouls, I give you my good brother, Lauren Morgan Richards. He is an author, an illustrator, a brilliant, wonderful man, good friend of mine. Kelly, hello. Lovely to see you. Happy to have you here as well. So we are going to be reading the Devil's Mansion. We sort of strayed a little bit from what we have traditionally been reading. This is 1931, so it's not quite 100 years old, but it is 1931, and it is a rather riveting story about, so far, there was a gentleman who was convinced to go up in Canada and ended up by finding himself lost in a rainstorm in his now classic roadster. And then along the way, he finds this mansion where he is unwelcomed and goes back down to the town. Here's the clock. He goes into this home and is unwelcomed. He goes back to the city, the little town rather, and he encounters this young woman who's to be the new caretaker for this very strange old woman. That is where we left off. I have other news. I'll tell you. Well, we'll talk about that afterwards. But anyway, chapter 4. The blinds were drawn on the windows, and there were no drapes. Running to one of them, Janet stopped halfway. Raja was snarling at her savagely. So instead of going to the window, she flung herself on the cot and sobbed. The place was so awful, so terrible, that the dog with the red, horrible, maniacal eyes. This empty, barn-like room, Miss Bosvain with the slimy chameleon around her neck, the candle that she had laid on the floor in its holder was glittering and dripping white wax. Looking past it among the shadows, she saw the dog still lying in the doorway, watching her. She would have thought him asleep. He was so quiet, except that his red eyes were wide open and on her. She was a little calmer now. Her sobs had ceased. She would be quiet, so quiet. Raja would think she was sleeping. He would go away, and then she could close and lock the door. Peering at the keyhole, she saw there was no key in it, and no kind of bolt. Well, tomorrow, she decided she would leave this place. Tomorrow, she would see Ms. Bosvain, and Ms. Bosvain would surely understand that she could stay no longer. Perhaps, though, the woman would be obdurate. Perhaps she would keep her. Ms. Bosvain was more than peculiar, Janet thought. She was insane. She must be to live like this way, to have this beast-like dog around and only a dumb woman as a servant. Janet saw again the face she had seen in the crystal. Blair Rodman's. By this time, he would be far away. He said he was going to Vancouver. She might never see him again. What did it mean, seeing his face in that crystal? Did it mean she was thinking of him? Miss Bosvane had said the crystal told the future, but Blair Rodman was gone. By this time he would be near Vancouver. And why had she lied to Miss Bosvane, told her it was her father's face she had seen in the crystal? Why, when she had no intention of lying, she had Mr. Rodman's name on her lips, and the name she had spoken was her father's? The girl pulled up the army blanket and covered herself. It was chilly in this big room, and she was shivering slightly, whether from the cold or nervousness she did not know. The candle was getting lower. Only half an inch more, and she would be in darkness. Then all she she could see would be Raj's gleaming eyes. Half an inch more of light. How long would that last? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour? She had never used candles before for light. Oh, in her father's house she had burned them occasionally for fun, but never for light. In this house there was no gas or electricity. That room downstairs, it was attractive even in its shabbiness. Once it must have been quite gorgeous. Now the damask hangings on the windows were soiled and frayed, the upholstery on the slender French chairs worn with age and badly faded. Only the silver and pewter candlesticks and china ornaments were fresh and shiny. The candle was nearly out. Now it was sputtering and smoking, filling the room with rancid odor of burning wax. A little glow left of a mere pinpoint, then complete darkness. Darkness such as Janet has never known before. When her eyes grew accustomed to it, she looked toward the door where the dog had been lying. Yes, Raja was still there, his eyes glowing like hot coals. The girl had no idea what time it was by now. When she had left the big room downstairs, the clock said 8, but she must have been upstairs an hour or more, perhaps longer. Soon, Miss Bosvane and Nita would be coming upstairs to bed. Then she would call and have them take Raja away. Drowsy, yet not daring fall asleep, Janet lay rigid, watching the dog's eyes. Time passed. She thought it must be nearly dawn, and she had waited so long. Still, no sound from the lower floor, not even the slight noise of a door opening. Her own breathing frightened her, so loud it seemed. She put her hand on her heart and felt it pounding wildly against the walls of her chest. What was that? Footsteps? A light tread walking down the hall, stopping now and walking again. Raj's eyes were not visible. She thought he must have gone. Then she saw his eyes again, bright as ever. Raja had just turned his head. Nita, she called loudly, yet this could not be Nita, because when she had come up with the servant, Nita had walked silently, stealthily, like a ghost in felt-soled slippers. Miss Bosvane! It must be Miss Bosvane who was coming down the hall. No, the tread was not as heavy as hers must be, for Miss Bosvane was a big woman. Back and forward the steps went, nearly to her door each time, but not quite. Miss Bosvane, will you please call the dog away? I can't sleep, Janet pleaded. But the footsteps did not stop. They went on, back and forth in the uncarpeted hall. When no one answered Janet thought she must be dreaming she had heard someone out there. She kept quiet for a minute or so. The footsteps continued as if someone were pacing deep in thought. Finally, the steps went further down the hall, getting fainter and fainter as they went. Now she could hear them no longer. Satisfied, she closed her eyes and breathed a sigh of relief. Someone had been in the hall. Probably Miss Bosvane or Nita. Whoever it had gone into a room at the far end. Hardly had she opened her eyes again when the same shrill whistle she heard in the living room came to her ears. The whistle Miss Bosvane had said might belong to a bird, but a whistle which the dog had obeyed. She could hear Raja rise and bound down the hall quickly. She went to the door and closed it. She was trembling and weary when she piled her 2 suitcases in front of her in front of the closed door and climbed into the hard cot, for she could find no key. Who was it she had heard in the hall? Whoever it was had listened to her calls to take Raja away, had listened and whistled, the same loud whistle in two notes. The first slightly higher, the second whistle, then the second whistle, the second. The whistle she had heard after tea in the living room. Miss Bosvain had been sitting beside her, so it could not have been she who whistled. Nita could not talk, or could she? Miss Bosvain had said she could not. Perhaps the maid could talk and could whistle too. The tread she had heard in the hall seemed to be flat-footed, and sure, she wondered what Miss Bosvain's feet were like. She had not seen them downstairs. They had been hidden under her long black dress. At any rate, she was more comfortable now with the dog gone and the door closed, much more comfortable, even if the suitcase prop at the door was none too secure. If anyone came into the room, the noise of the bags falling to the floor would awaken her. Relieved, she tried to fall asleep. But as she was drowsing off, she heard the tread outside again, as it had been before. It was muffled now because the door was closed tightly. As quietly as she could, Janet got out of the cot, slipped off her Oxfords, and in her stocking feet crept to the window, and pulled up the blind. She could not see out of the glass, for the heavy shutters were drawn over it from the outside. She thought of unfastening them, but decided against it because she did not want to make any noise. Carefully, she drew down the shade. The footsteps outside were still audible. Whoever was out there had not heard her. Tiptoeing across the room, she slipped into the cot and tried again to fall asleep. The fragrant odor of sweet tobacco seemed to permeate the room. Perhaps the person in the hall was smoking. She would ask Miss Bosvain tomorrow if she smoked, she thought dreamily. Chapter 5. The sun was streaming through the open window when the girl awakened. The tassel of the blind was blowing in the morning breeze, and the shutters were fastened back to the stone walls. Startled, she rubbed her eyes. She had left the blind down and the window shut the night before. She was sure someone must have been in the room while she was asleep and opened it. She looked at the suitcase against the door. They were just as they had left. Oh, sorry, 1 second. I thought I put this on. Sorry, I thought I put that on Do Not Disturb. The sun was streaming through the open window when the girl awakened. The tassel, oh, we read this part. The suitcases were just as she had left them. But who had come in? Nita, she thought, a little relieved. When she had come up to bed, perhaps Janet went to the window and looked out. Her room must be on the side of the house, for she did not remember this view at all. A little clearing in the forest near the house, a clearing full of overgrown shrubs. Beyond this, the giant firs rising high against the deep blue sky. The clearing looked as if it had once been a garden, for she could distinguish the round basin of the stone fountain in the midst, a basin half covered with trailing moss and weeds, hidden from the shrubs. The greenish-white figure of a statue was visible. It seemed to be that of a fat Cupid, although the bow in his left hand was broken and the right hand entirely gone. Leaning far out the window, she saw at the extreme end of the neglected garden the roof of a little structure which was almost as at the rear of the house. It was low, and the bushes and shrubs came almost to the roof. Something lithe and dark was running swiftly through the bushes. An animal that disappeared into the forest. Raja, she imagined, for she half recognized the pointed, alert ears and the color of the dog. The sky was so blue, bluer than she had ever seen it before. The forest in front of her was still, as if it was holding its breath for a moment. A bird was singing and rippling, a happy song somewhere among the trees, but the tones came sweet and clear to her ears. Hers was the only window open on the side of the house. All the rest were shuttered tightly. Stepping back into the middle of the room, Janet noticed a big bowl of water on the floor near the cot. She was thankful for it, and gave herself a hasty sponge bath. But how had the window been opened, the door pushed back without disturbing the suitcases? She was a light sleeper and awakened instantly at the slightest noise. Surely she would have heard the suitcase crash to the floor. The door into the hall was a full-length, large gold frame. She had not noticed it in the darkness the night before. Carved heavily, the gilt cornices were dull and almost bronzed with age. She saw at once it had held no mirror. Now it only framed the panel door. On the door to the closet was another such frame, also empty of glass. Puzzled, Janet went forward to examine the closet frame. There were grooves for the mirror, and putting her fingers in them, she drew them away quickly, for she felt a sharp edge of glass. The mirrors had been cut from the frames. The room was a large one, and seemed more desolate, more terrible to her in the daylight than it had the night before. A fireplace, which reached from the floor to the high ceiling, was boarded at the mouth. This stood against the wall near the windows. Sighing as she opened her suitcase, she searched for a small hand mirror of silver which belonged to a toilet set her father had given her years before. There it was. She thought she had put it on top, where she could get it readily. Idly, she took the mirror in her hands and looked into it. Startled, she looked again. The glass had been taken out, and she was looking into a bit of cardboard which had backed the mirror. Yes, her bags had been opened, and although her things were neatly arranged, they were not in the same place she had put them, and when she packed in Vancouver for the trip. Her purse. There was a small mirror in the compact in her purse. On the bed she had left it, but it was opened and hunted for the compact. It was gone. Hastily putting on fresh blue crepe dress, she carefully arranged her suitcases again, put her hat in readiness on the cot, and her light coat near it. She was determined to leave at the first opportunity. There was not a sound in the hall. As she shortly opened the door and peered out, it was as if no one in the house, not even the muffled hint of footsteps coming from the lower floor. Trembling slightly, as she closed the door of her room, after she started down the hall, a series of closed doors on each side, the stairs in front of her, winding flight going up to the third floor with smooth, graceful railings, one down with the same turned banisters. The hall was bare of furniture and rugs. Undecided about descending the stairs, Janet walked down the hall quietly. At the door next to her own, she paused and touched the knob. Gaining more confidence, she turned it and looked in. The room was empty, even more so than hers. Not even a cot, and the blinds were drawn. Mirrors in this room, too, she saw had been removed. Closing the door silently, she made her way to the next, looking back at each step, holding her breath for fear she would hear Raja running up the stairs. After her tour of the floor, she went back to the stairs, her face whiter than it had been. All the rooms were empty. Nothing in any of them. Where did Nita sleep? And Miss Bosvain? Why had they put her on the empty floor? Perhaps they had their rooms on the third floor, or even the first. Her hand on the railing, she started to go down when Nita appeared at the door below and waited for her. Janet called, "Good morning," which Nita responded to with a nod of her head. When the girl reached the bottom of the flight, the servant held open the swinging door into the living room. Mechanically, Janet still tiptoed on the heavy rug and made her way to Miss Bosvain's chair, a firm cast to her red lips and her eyes shining with determination. "Good morning, Miss Lord," her employer said, smiling her cold, hard smile. "Good morning," Janet answered shortly and sat down in the chair near her. The sun coming through the side windows lighted up the high old room, pointing with glowing fingers to the raveled hangings, the faded rug, the tattered upholstery on the chairs, the windows at the far end were tightly draped. These, Janet decided, were in the front. "Are you ready for breakfast?" Miss Bosvane asked. The banjo clock on the wall showed nearly 9 o'clock. "After I talk to you, Miss Bosvane," Janet said. "I'm leaving as soon as I can. I don't understand the house, nor you, and I can't possibly be happy in a place where I can't have a decent room." "Leaving?" And Miss Bosvane's pinkish brows lifted inquisitively. "Yes." "When?" "At once, as soon as I've had my breakfast." "I can't spare you," the woman said coldly. "Nevertheless, I am going. There will be no transportation out of here for a month, when Mr. McClure comes again with the groceries and supplies. I can walk." Miss Bosvane grunted. The grunt was more like a cackle. "Raja will not let you go, Miss Lord, so you had better forget your little plan to walk to Bosvane." "Raja will not let me?" "He has his orders, and he obeys them. You will stay until I am ready for you to go." I I don't understand," the girl faltered. "I warn you, Raja has orders to keep you here. He is dangerous. Even I," and the woman's voice sank to whisper, "even I am afraid of him. And keep a charm." She touched the chameleon with which was snuggling against the yellow of her neck. "To protect myself from him, do nothing to cross him. But I can't be forced to stay here against my will." Miss Bosvane said nothing to this, only looked enigmatically into the fire. Roger was heard at the door, jumping to push it open. Janet shrank back, frightened. The dog came in slowly, straight for the girl, and crouched at her feet, snarling a little, as if it were displeased with something. Janet had not noticed that Nita had brought in a breakfast tray and left it on the table, so engrossed was she in watching Raja. Miss Bosvane called to her attention to the tray, and poured a cup of coffee for the girl. "I must go," Janet exclaimed suddenly. After she had drained the cup and set it down, she made a move to rise, but the dog leaped to his feet and snarled cruelly, his teeth bared and his head thrown back angrily. He would not let her pass, and she was forced to sit down. "You see," Miss Bosvane said shortly. "But if he's your dog, you can call him off, can't you?" Janet pleaded, tears springing to her eyes. "He does not obey me." "Then you say you were not comfortable last night?" Miss Bosvane interrupted, changing the subject. "I had only a cot, nothing else in my room, and only an army blanket on the cot," the girl answered bitterly. Miss Bosvane's eyebrows lifted again. "I'm sorry. I gave Nita orders. I cannot superintend things myself, as I haven't been out of this room for 10 years." Janet glanced at the woman in dismay. Was she an invalid? She remembered now that the 2 times she had been with her, Miss Bosvane had always kept her chair. Don't you walk?" she asked half timidly. "No." "I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I wish you had told me. Then it was Nita I heard last night walking back and forth near my door in the hall." Miss Bosvane shook her head. "Nita does not sleep upstairs." "But I heard someone walking. I was not dreaming." "You were probably mistaken, my child. My father always used to say that the house was haunted." "I don't believe in ghosts." "You believe in the face you saw on the crystal, didn't you?" Janet looked at the woman for an instant, wide-eyed. Yes, she believed in that. She had seen Blair Rodman's face as plainly as she had seen her own. "Well, anyway, my room was entered last night while I was asleep, and a mirror taken from me. The frame was left, but the glass was taken." "You are imagining things. The house has frightened you." "No, I'm sure, and I had a compact I had was stolen from my purse." "Do you mean this?" said Miss Bosvane, picked up a small silver case from the table beside her. Yes, Janet reached for it and snapped it open. The powder was intact, but the mirror, which faced the little cake of powder, was gone. "The mirror is gone," she said, rather puzzled. "You will not need a mirror here, child." Janet looked at these empty frames in the room. Her eyes traveled slowly from one to another. She opened her mouth to comment on them when Miss Bursvane spoke. "There are no mirrors in the house. You will not miss them." Then, changing the subject abruptly, "Would you like to look around the place? Raja will go with you." "I'd rather go alone." Miss Bursvane shrugged her shoulders. "Then you will probably stay here, for Raja will follow you wherever you go." "Miss Bursvane, if Raja is your dog, why don't you tell him to leave me alone?" "Because I have no control over him." "He will not bother me unless I leave the place." "No." "Then perhaps I will look around the grounds a little. How do I get out?" "Either by the front door or through the kitchen. Nita will be pleased if you take your tray back to her. She has plenty to do." Without a word, Janet lifted the tray and carried it out of the room. Raja was at her heels, following her closely. In the hall, she paused for a moment, and seeing a door open, went through it into a pantry, where empty shelves stared at her. From there she entered the kitchen, and deposited the tray on a table near the servant, who was rolling out some biscuits on a floured board. The kitchen was meagerly furnished, only a big iron stove in which a fire was burning brightly, a chair, and a table. "Can I get out this way?" Janet asked politely. Nita pointed to the door, but Janet lingered and watched the woman roll her dough, quickly and deftly. Raja was waiting, ears cocked at the door. The girl felt Nita's eyes on her for a second, an uncomfortable second. She was about to turn and leave when the maid plucked her sleeve and pulled her back. With a blunt, stiff finger, Nita was writing slowly on the flour with the board. Janet watched the words she formed. With her other hand, the servant was cutting the biscuit swiftly. The sentence took shape, the letters crudely made. Janet, when she read it, gave a low, hardly audible gasp, which was more like a sigh than a cry. Nita's message in the white flour danced before her eyes. Get away from here now if you can." A quick brush of her fingers and Nita had obliterated the message and was spreading fresh flour from the shaker in its place. Janet lingered. She was going to write more, but the servant went calmly on with her work. Raja was snarling with impatience, as if it were chafing at Janet's delay. Nita pointed to the door and nodded. This meant the girl thought that she should go. She started reluctantly. The dog was ahead of her. When she glanced back at the homely, dumb woman at the table, Nita's eyes were on her, brown, beady eyes, half filled with tears. She put a floury hand up to wipe them away. As Janet went out the door, she decided Nita was her friend. Chapter 6. Janet walked quickly down the overgrown path. The path had once been wide, but now the shrubs with their stout leafy branches had closed in on it, until there was hardly room for one person. The dog was at her heels. At the back of the house was a clearing, and beyond this a stable of stone like the house. The cobblestone paths that led to it were covered with moss and weeds, hardly distinguishable. Back at the stable, she thought she saw a kitchen garden, and looked again to see if she was right. She was, and the garden was tiled. The rows, freshly tilled. The rows even and well cultivated. Was this Nita's work too? The garden was not large, only a small field. At one side, corn was growing, tall stalks waving yellow tassels. A few rows of beets, some beans, rhubarb, and lettuce growing to seed. It was fenced in with barbed wire. At the far end, the forest grew, thick and heavy. Janet avoided the barn, which seemed deserted, and walked back to the kitchen door. And from there, through the neglected garden, she had seen from her window. She looked up and recognized it, for it was still open. The third from the front she counted. In its heyday, the garden must have been lovely. Even now, in its wildness, it was enticing. She found a stone bench near the overgrown pool and sat down on it to look around. At her feet she saw stones which had bordered a narrow path. The growth was so tall, so rank, that she could not see the low garden house from where she sat. Rising, she tried to make out the outlines. It was not Even then it was not visible, so she stood on the bench. Yes, there it was. She could see a small peaked roof, weather stained, except for a few patches of fresh new shingles. There must be a path to it, somewhere. She searched around the garden, but found none, and giving it up, for the brush was thick and almost impassable. She followed another path, which was close to the house around the front. On the yellow, tall grass in front, she had another view of the house, the same she had seen the day before when the truck had wound up the ruddy road to the porch. Janet shuddered a little when she looked at the house, so big, so gray, so bleak. The turrets at each side had windows in them, she could see now, windows so small that to the girl standing far below they seemed no larger than a foot square. Could there be rooms up there too, in those towers? She turned away for the thought, for she thought she heard a brook somewhere at the edge of the grass. Inadvertently, she glanced back at the house, then at the towers. How could she get away from it? Miss Bosvain had said Raja would not let her go, a dog keeping her prisoner, yet Miss Bosvain had said the dog did not obey her. Whom did Raja obey? The whistle she had heard twice in the house? But who was making that shrill whistle? Nita's warning. The girl thought of it again, written in flour on the kitchen table, the warning to leave today if she could. Was that the sun glinting on the window in the east tower? For these windows were not shuttered. Again, Janet looked at the west tower. There she saw sun shining on the glass, reflecting a million diamonds. No, the other window was different, duller and something, or somebody was looking out. The girl strained her eyes. It was a face she saw. Instinctively, she waved her hand to the face, which was blurred so by the sun that she could not see it. She thought there was an answering wave. Stepping closer to avoid the glare of the light, she looked up again. The face framed the small window. It seemed girlish, and yet she could not tell. Again, she waved. She waved her hand, and now she was sure the hand waved back, a slender, graceful hand, bare to the elbow. It must be a girl. The face was young, and brownish mass of hair covered the forehead. Was she dreaming? No, the hand was beckoning her to come. Stumbling a little in the grass, she ran forward, forgetting the dog, forgetting everything but the face in the tower. However, when Raja leaped ahead, she dropped back suddenly and looked anxiously at the animal. She could not find her way to the east tower room, not with Raja following her. She would wait. Slowly she went up to the porch and turned the knob of the door leading into the living room. It was opened, and she entered hesitantly. Should she say anything to Miss Bosvain about the face she had seen in the window? Miss Bosvain had said there were only 3 people in the house, Nita, Janet, and herself. Should she tell her employer that a person is in the tower had beckoned her to come? The girl sat down on a chair near the fire. No, she wouldn't. Miss Bosvain would only say she was mistaken, as she had said when Janet had told her about the footsteps outside the door last night. Nice walk, Miss Lord. Yes, Janet looked around for Raja, but he had not entered the room. This would be a gorgeous place if the grounds were cared for. I had a hard time making my way around the house. Where did you go? Oh, just around the house. Shall I read to you? Not this morning. This will be a holiday for you. Janet sat quietly for a while, now and then stealing a look at the woman opposite her. Miss Bosvain seemed rather pensive this morning. Dejected, the girl thought. She was looking at the fire, deep in thought, and her big hands were lying on the arms of her chair. Don't you feel well, Miss Bosvain? I feel as usual, which is neither good nor bad. If you had a wheelchair, I could wheel you out into the sunshine, Janet offered kindly. I hate sunshine. I haven't been out for years, and I shall never go out. Janet shut her lips tightly. She had only meant to be kind. You think I'm mad, don't you, child? I'm not, so don't bother yourself about me. I go about things in my own way, the only way I can in this house, which I hate. Why don't you go away, then, if you hate it? Miss Bosvane looked at her, half startled. Then her head sank forward to her on her breast, and she sighed a heavy, sonorous sigh. I can't. I shall die here, in this house that I left as a girl because I hated it so. But in your girlhood, wasn't it a beautiful place? Weren't the gardens well kept and the rooms all furnished? Yes, it was beautiful. I was born here and stayed until I was 17 years old. Then I ran away from the house of my father. I lived just outside Paris for years. I thought I would never have to come back, but I did, and I shall stay this time. I can't run away. I am too old, and I cannot walk. I have been here for 10 years now. 10 years. Each of them a century. Nita was here when I left as a girl. She was a girl too, then. The daughter of my father's cook. She too has been here all these years, and she hates it, but she cannot go. She must stay too. You will stay too, my child, as I have stayed forever. No! Janet looked at the woman, frightened. No! Miss Bosvane nodded her head. Anyone who comes here, says my child. There was a long silence. Says, anyone who comes here stays, I'm sure is what they mean. Anyone who comes here stays, my child. There was a long silence. Janet said no more about going away, although she was determined to ever get away. Perhaps tonight she would go after she had made a trip to the tower room, when everything in the big house was quiet and Raja was away. Perhaps tonight she could walk the distance to Bosvane. She could make it somehow. Miss Bosvane was fondling the chameleon with the tips of her fingers. It was half on her bosom and half on her dress. Janet noticed the lower part of the reptile changing slowly to a dirty black. The thin gold chain was fastened to its neck, hung loosely down the woman's dress. It was so fine that it appeared to be a golden thread. Where do you sleep at night, Miss Bosvane? The girl asked timidly. Here, in this chair. The back tilts over, and I use that footstool. She pointed to a hassock nearby. For an extension, I live in this chair as I have lived for years and years. How long have you been lame? I'm not lame, my child. I just cannot walk. I haven't been able to walk for 20 years. The dog is coming. I can't hear him, but I can. I am used to his footsteps in the kitchen. My ears are turned so that I can hear the slightest sound. Raja hates me more than I hate him, but he dares not touch me, dares not look at me. Miss Bosvane was right about the dog. He had shouldered his way through the swinging door and was in the room. In a moment, he was at Janet's feet, glaring at her with his red eyes. Janet arose and went to the old piano. She opened the cover slowly and looked down at the yellow keys, which shone like satin. She was about to strike a chord when she was startled by her employer's voice. Don't! You must never play that. The girl stopped, her hands in the air. She closed the lid quietly and walked back to the fire. Why? Don't you like it? I love it, but I have not played for years. You must never touch it. The woman seemed frightened. Her voice quavered with excitement. I didn't mean to alarm you, Janet said as she resumed her chair. But I love to play too, and I've been longing to touch the instrument since I first saw it. I used to play to my father for hours at a time. Miss Bosvain was breathing heavily as she leaned back in her chair. Her hand was trembling on the arm of the chair, and her eyes were closed. A shrill whistle sounded, and Raja leaped to his feet and was out the door in an instant. Janet looked inquiringly at the woman, who was still shaken and weak. What had she done to upset her so? Miss Bosvain's eyes opened slowly, and she looked at Janet. A film of pain seemed to shadow her plain face. She bent over and motioned Janet to lean toward her. She could scarcely hear the woman's whisper as she inclined her head. I like you, child, and I would let you go. If I could. But I can't. Chapter 7. But can't you make a special trip up there and take me? Blair Rodman asked McClure. They were sitting in McClure's garage, and the mechanic was fussing with the brakes of a small car. I have orders to never go there unless I have supplies from Jimson, and I advise you not to go by yourself. You don't know that dog. Damn it all, I'll take my gun, and if the beast gets rambunctious, I'll feed him a dose of lead. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, Blair Rodman, that was where we are. Damn it, I'll take my gun, and if that beast gets rambunctious, I'll feed him a dose of lead. Easy to say, but what if the dog attacked you before you had time to get your gun out? Rodman shrugged his shoulders. That's easy. I'll be ready for him. What about this other girl you took up there a few months back? I don't know, except that she asked me a lot of questions on the way up, all about the house and Miss Bosvain. I didn't say much because it wasn't my place to. I had a letter from the old lady instructing me if the girl came bringing her up. That's all. Didn't have any messages about the girl who came yesterday. Miss Lord, did you say was her name? The other girl I took up was rather pretty and had brown hair and blue eyes, I think. I remember the eyes because she said she thought it queer that Miss Bosvain especially had asked her in the ad for a girl with blue eyes. She thought it might be because Miss Bosvain was old and set in her ways. Pretty little thing she was, although not so pretty as Miss Lord. Not nearly so pretty. She chattered all the way up and said, like Miss Lord did, she thought that she'd like the place. At least she'd try it. I left her like I did Miss Lord on the porch. After I had taken her small trunk off, she had a bag and a small steamer trunk. Then I beat it. You say you left Miss Lord on the porch? Rodman asked. Yes, she hadn't gone in yet, but I had honked my horn all the way up the road like I usually do, and Nita probably came out to get her. I don't know why you're hanging around town here, Mr. Rodman. It won't do any good. You can't get into the house anyway, even if you want to. I'll get in some way. I've just seen enough to be powerfully curious. Tell me some more about this queer woman. Everybody around here thinks I know a lot of... I don't tell, simply because I'm the only one who goes up there. But I don't. I don't know anything about the place or Miss Bosvain. She must have a lot of money up there, though. Cash, too. Nita always gives me currency, and I get $15 every time I make the trip. That was agreed on, although I'd been satisfied with a lot less. Only 12 miles round trip, you know. Blair, still unsatisfied, went to call Mr. Jimson, who, McClure had told him had played with Miss Bosvain when she was a girl. He found the woman, her hair silvery gray, in her kitchen, baking. Offering him a chair, she went on with her work, her kindly face shadowing a little as he explained the object of his visit. I understand that as a girl you used to see her frequently, Blair suggested. Yes, I did, but I haven't laid eyes on her since she went away. She was about 17. Let me see, that was... She counted on her floury fingers. Let me see, about 38 years ago. She was a lot of fun then. We had a lot of good times together. I used to ride up to her father's house and stay for days at a time. I didn't like her father, though. Old Simeon Bosvain, hard and cold man with none too good manners. Nita was there then, too. And there used to we there and we three used to play together in the garden. Nita Rogers must be as old as I am now. She paused for a moment to brush a wisp of hair from her eyes. Well, when I was 17 and Morel Miss Bosevain's name is Morel, was the same age, I went up to spend a week. Morel was different than I had ever seen her before, more quiet and more reserved. I slept in her room at night with her, and I thought I heard her crying once in a while. Once, when I woke up, she wasn't there, and I lay awake for a long time wondering where she was. But although I must have waited for her for an hour or so, she didn't come in. Old Simeon had some guests. A few men were hunting, and I think she was interested in one of them. At times, Morel would start to confide something to me, but each time she stopped. Light-hearted, I didn't think anything about it. Where was I? Miss Jemson stopped to slide the cake into the oven. Ah, yes. I was visiting Morel for her birthday. Saturday morning, I went home, riding along to my father's house, which was 15 miles away. That was nothing to me. I was a good rider and a fast one. You wouldn't think so now. Morel had her horse too, and we used to have great rides together. She usually rode halfway home with me, but this time she didn't. She promised, though, to come over to my house the following week to stay overnight. The 15 miles between our houses meant nothing to us. Not then. We didn't have telephones in those days, no way to find out anything, so we were expecting Morel the next Friday. I had planned a little party. She didn't come, and we didn't hear from her. I was afraid she might be sick, so as soon as I could get away the next day, I started over to see her. The snow was falling hard when I left, and I had an awful time making my way along. It was night before I reached the house. I went in. Nita's mother answered the door, and I asked her where Morel was. She said Morel had gone away, abroad. I was amazed, of course, that Morel hadn't told me, her best friend, anything about her trip. Her father told me later that she had gone away suddenly to Paris to visit some relatives, and that she wouldn't be back for a long time. He seemed very angry and colder than I had ever seen him before. I stayed the night there because I had to, but it seemed queer without Morel. Nita said she didn't know a thing about the trip, but she said there had been a terrible quarrel between Morel and her father, and that when Morel came out of the room where she had been talking to her father, there was a bruise across her face, as if she had been struck with a whip. The next morning, when Nita had gone up to Morel's room, she was gone. She ran and told Simeon, who had said his daughter had gone abroad. Even Nita didn't know she was going. I always thought that Nita knew more about the whole thing than she told, but she wouldn't confide in me. Morel and her father weren't very congenial. He was cruel, and she had a will of her own, too. She was his only child and the heir to all his land and money, and had plenty of both. I've never went back to the house again, but now and then I used to see Nita, who, after her mother died, took care of the old gentleman. She didn't say much about the house, except that Morel never wrote. The old man began to get queer, and Nita kept closer and closer to the house. Years would pass, and I wouldn't see her. She could talk then, but she didn't have much to say. She didn't know whether Morel was ever coming back. There was only the other room in the house as Simeon grew older, a man who had been with him for years. He drove back and forth in a horse and buggy to town for supplies, but he was pretty feeble and old. 5 years after Simeon died, Morel came home, and the old man, I think his name was Nick, was sent away with enough money to keep him for life. But he died a few weeks after he came to Beausvain. Nita and Morel had the only ones in the big house now. I can't imagine how Nita takes care of it. I wrote to Morel a note. I wrote Morel a note when she came, sort of a welcome note, asking her if I could call. I got the note back unopened. I never bothered her since, and I never will. Ray McClure says Nita can't talk now. Maybe she can't, but she could when I saw her 15 years ago, after Simeon died. Talk as well as I could, although, as I say, she didn't have much to tell. She had been with Simeon so much. Simeon left his money to his daughter? Blair asked. Yes, all of it. He didn't have anybody else to leave it to. A pretty situation with a woman when a woman won't see her girlhood friend. Miss Jimson's eyes sparkled with anger. A petty, a pretty situation. I don't believe she is there at all, Ray McClure says. He has never seen her. I saw her, Mrs. Jimson. You saw her? Yes, it must have been she. A woman about 55 or 60 with a mop of red hair that was turning gray. Yes, that sounds like Morel. She had the red hair like her father. What'd she say? It was a frightful night, and my car was stuck in the mud. I burst into her house, and she let her dog attack me. Did she? It doesn't sound like Morel. She was a kind thing when she was young. A big woman, isn't she? Seemed very large, although she was sitting in a chair by the fire. Was she ever married? No, she still is Miss Bosvain. Funny how some people change, isn't it? How anybody can have that savage dog around is a mystery to me. But I imagine she has it too. She has it so she will have no visitors at all. And let me tell you, no one from here visits her. If I were Ray McClure, I wouldn't go there either. But he needs the money she gives him, I suppose. Your husband has an order from her each month, doesn't he? Yes, and if I were in his place, I wouldn't put it up, of course, begrudgingly. She pays cash, and most of the others don't, and she gets a pile of stuff. Not only groceries, but tools, now and then, and tobacco. Miss Jimson sniffed audibly and closed her lips in disgust. Who smokes up there? Oh, I suppose Nita or Morel. I'm not modern at all, and I don't mind saying that women shouldn't smoke. Some of them do, though, Mrs. Jimson. I know, but it isn't right. Blair rose to leave. I just wanted you to know what kind of woman Miss Bosvain is. I happen to know a girl who went up there to be her companion, and, well, I'd think twice before I'd let a daughter of mine go up to that mad house. Blair left, thanking Miss Jimson kindly for her information. His roadster was outside the gate before he stepped into it. He felt in his pocket for a revolver and, snapping open the barrel, found it was loaded. Laying it on the seat, he started the car and, driving up the street, headed for the hills. The sun was high overhead when he reached the gate marked private and jumped out of his car to open it. It slid back easily on its hinges, and leaving it ajar, he started slowly up the slight hill, and when well around the curve, he saw the spot where his car had skidded into the ditch, turning into the narrow road which he had seen McClure take. He passed over an old bridge spanning the creek. The road wound from there up to the house, which he could just glimpse now. Managing his wheel with his left hand, he groped on the leather seat of his revolver, and finding it, kept firm hold of it while steered the roadster with one steady hand. Blair was taking no chance. He had not seen the dog yet, but if it bothered him, he would shoot. Surely Janet Lord would not mind if he stopped and asked her how she liked this lonely place and whether she wanted to stay. He could not go on to Vancouver until he knew. The girl with violet eyes was beginning to interest him strangely. He saw her again sitting beside him in the back of the truck, her eyes tired, her pale face glowing in the late afternoon sunlight, the shadow of her dark lashes on her cheek, her slight figure bending forward towards him when the truck lurched, her golden hair and the fine ringlets on her forehead. A plucky girl. Not many who would pay their father's debts and stick at the job until they were sick with fatigue. Not many. The house seemed deserted to him. The blinds were down. There was not a sign of life anywhere. Perhaps Janet Lord was in that big living room, reading now to Miss Bosvain. Reading in that low, throaty voice of hers, her violet eyes down on the book, and her frail fingers turning the pages quietly. He might be a fool's errand. But then, McClure had said, he took another girl up there 2 months back, and that girl had not come down. Of course, it was possible she had been called for in a car and had left at night. The house, however, Miss Bosvain had boasted, had no telephone. Blair could not figure the problem out. It might be that the old lady wanted 2 companions around the house, one to relieve the other. His car was going silently up the grade to the house. It hardly made a sound. So well tuned was the big motor. He stopped the wide porch and sat indecisively for a moment, a slight frown on his forehead. His eyes were on the door of the big room. Then, with a leap, he was out of the car and on the running board. A snarl, he had looked around. The dog was coming toward him, mouth open, teeth gleaming white. Blair pulled the trigger out of his revolver and a shot rang out, clear and loud in the still air. Another as the dog stood still, and then made another leap at him. He had missed. Jumping back into the car, he fired again and again. His foot was, as he fired automatically, stepped on the starter. God, had he missed every time? He wasn't a bad shot. He was a good one. Yet the dog was still snarling and leaping at the car, a savage, bestial look on its face. Jamming in his gear, the car lurched forward into the grass field. Blair guided it quickly into the road and gave it all the power it had. He could hear the angry snarls of the beast behind him. Over the shaky bridge he sped and into the highway again. Then he was through an open gate where he slowed up and looked back. The dog was standing at the gate, his teeth bared, and his head thrown back menacingly. Lucky he had left the gate open. He thought he heard a peculiar shrill whistle. Listened for another. None came. When he glanced back at the dog again, it had disappeared. 4 bullets, Blair thought, as he gripped the wheel. 4 bullets and none of them hit the mark. And he had been so close to the hound, 20 feet away at first, and then 10, easy range, and then he missed all the shots. He stopped the car and opened the gun to be sure. 4 shells had been discharged. There were 2 more. He couldn't have missed 4 shots. McClure was right. The animal was the devil's own dog. Driving dejectedly back to Beausvein, he pulled up to McClure's garage. I think that's where we'll end for the evening, because this is another long chapter. And I think it's a very good spot to end. I dropped mine. Let's go back and read some of the things. Good evening. Hello. Good evening, John Maxwell. Sweet Ciara, I'm sorry I wasn't able to tune in the past 2 Fridays. I took a trip to North Carolina to see my boyfriend. Oh, good. I'm glad you did. I'm glad you had a good time. I am going to be moving to New Orleans next week. So I have quite a road trip coming up too. I'm going to try to continue reading. I haven't set up, of course, internet or things, so that's going to be quite tricky, but I look forward nonetheless. I'm optimistically nervous, I guess. I'm rather nervous, but I know it's for the better, and I'm looking forward to it. Also, I have the debauchery ball coming up the 2nd of September. 2nd of September. I'm sorry, my mind is sort of splayed everywhere. Also, I'll be in Youngstown, Ohio, in October. You can find me there. Of course, Wednesday night, we're going to be doing Witches Movie Coven. And this coming Wednesday, we'll be doing American Horror Story Coven, because it takes place in New Orleans. So we'll be discussing that. And with that, I think that's where we leave you for the evening. Thank you for all of your likes, comments, and shares. Thank you for being here. I know we're a small crowd, but it is a fun one. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.